Zane had painted many unusual clients in his career, wealthy merchants who insisted their robotic pets be included in family portraits. A mining captain who demanded his helmet stay on because he believed oxygen improved his jawline. Once he even painted a 3-meter amphibious ambassador who refused to sit still unless someone sprayed water on him every 5 minutes. But when the Royal Courier drone arrived at his tiny orbital studio and projected a golden holographic seal across the room, Zane immediately suspected that the universe had found a new way to make his life complicated. The drone's voice echoed politely. Portrait artist Zane Halberg, you have been formally requested by Her Majesty Queen Kyra of the Aurelian Empire. Zane blinked slowly. He looked around his cluttered studio as if someone else might answer the message instead. Paint tablets floated in the air beside half-finished digital canvases. His coffee machine hummed like a tired starship engine. The drone repeated the message. Zane rubbed his eyes. That's a queen. Yes, the drone replied helpfully. And she wants a portrait. Yes. Of course she does, Zane muttered. The holographic contract expanded across the room, glowing softly with alien symbols. Zane leaned closer to read the translation, while his chair slowly spun beneath him. Travel to Aurelian Prime. Official Royal Portrait Commission. Compensation, astronomical. He paused at that word. Astronomical was a very persuasive measurement. Still, something about the message felt strange. Royal commissions were usually handled by prestigious academies or famous galactic artists. Zane was talented, but he worked alone in a modest orbiting station above a quiet trade world. His reputation was respectable, but not exactly legendary. He scrolled further down. A small note appeared near the bottom of the contract. Previous artists were unable to complete the commission. Zane frowned. Unable was an interesting choice of words. He leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling, while the drone patiently hovered nearby. Unable because they were busy? Zane asked. No information provided. Unable because they quit. No information provided. Unable because the queen ate them? The drone paused for a moment as if checking its database. No information provided. That is not comforting, Zane sighed. The drone projected another message. Royal transportation will arrive in 2 hours. Zane sat up immediately. 2 hours? Yes. He looked around his chaotic studio again. Half his equipment was still covered in paint dust. His clothes were scattered across the floor like casualties of a very lazy battle. You know, he said to the drone, most people send invitations weeks in advance. The drone hovered silently. Zane stood up and stretched his arms. Fine, he said. Let's go meet a queen. 2 hours later, Zane stood inside the observation deck of a sleek royal cruiser as it slipped silently through hyperspace. The ship moved so smoothly it felt less like flying and more like drifting through a dream. Outside the window, strange rivers of light bent across the darkness. A tall alien officer stood nearby, watching him with polite curiosity. Zane tried not to stare back. The officer looked almost human, except for his long pointed ears and silver eyes that reflected the stars like mirrors. So, Zane said casually, I'm guessing the queen looks similar to you? The officer nodded. Yes. Good, Zane said, because I once painted a client with 14 eyes, and that became very complicated. The officer tilted his head. Why? Zane sighed. Perspective. The officer seemed unsure if that was a joke. After a long silence, Zane asked the question that had been bothering him since the contract appeared. Why me? The officer looked toward the stars. Many artists came before you. Ah, Zane said carefully. They refused to continue. Did the queen dislike their work? The officer hesitated slightly. No. That answer was somehow worse. Zane crossed his arms. Then why did they leave? The officer studied him quietly before answering. Most could not look at her. Zane blinked. That seems inconvenient for portrait painting. The officer said nothing. The cruiser exited hyperspace a few minutes later, revealing a massive violet planet surrounded by rings of shimmering structures. A colossal palace floated above the atmosphere, like a crown made of crystal towers and glowing bridges. Zane pressed his face closer to the window. Okay, he whispered. That's impressive. The officer nodded. The royal court awaits your arrival. As the cruiser descended toward the palace, Zane suddenly realized something strange. He wasn't nervous. Curious, yes. Confused, definitely. But nervous, not really. He had spent his entire life studying faces. Human, alien, robotic, sometimes even accidentally abstract. Artists didn't just see faces the way others did. They saw shapes, emotions, hidden patterns, stories, and somewhere inside that enormous palace waited a queen whose face frightened everyone who looked at her. Zane leaned back with a small, thoughtful smile. "Well," he said quietly, "this might be the most interesting face I've ever painted." The royal palace did not feel like a building. It felt like walking inside a living constellation. Zane followed two armored guards through a corridor that seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of them. The floor was made of transparent crystal panels, beneath which faint rivers of light flowed slowly, like glowing veins inside the structure of the palace itself. Above them, enormous curved windows revealed the violet clouds of the planet far below. Zane glanced down through the glass floor. "Okay," he said quietly, "I'm definitely not looking down again." One of the guards tilted his head. "You fear heights?" "No," Zane replied calmly. "I fear falling with style." The guards did not laugh. Zane suspected they had never been trained to laugh while escorting royal guests. They continued walking. Every few meters they passed strange floating devices, hovering silently in the air. Some projected holographic star charts. Others scanned Zane briefly as he walked by. He waved awkwardly at one of them. "Hello." The scanner beeped politely and moved away. Eventually the corridor opened into an enormous chamber filled with tall pillars that curved upward like elegant white trees. At the center of the room stood a raised platform surrounded by soft glowing lights. Several figures were already waiting. Advisors, Zane guessed. They wore long ceremonial clothing and watched him the way scientists might observe an unusual insect. Zane waved again. Nobody waved back. One of the advisors stepped forward. He looked older than the others, with long silver hair and the same elegant pointed ears Zane had seen on the ship's officer. "You are the human artist." "That's what my business card says," Zane replied. The advisor did not react. "You have been summoned to create the official portrait of Her Majesty Queen Kara." "Yes, I heard something about that," Zane said. The advisor studied him carefully. "Before you meet the Queen, there is something you must understand." Zane folded his arms. "I suspected there might be." The advisor glanced briefly at the other members of the court before continuing. "Many artists have attempted this commission." "I read that part," Zane said. "They all failed." Zane nodded slowly. "Did the Queen dislike their paintings?" "No." "Did they run out of paint?" "No." "Did someone accidentally sit on the canvas?" The advisor looked genuinely confused. "No." Zane sighed. "Then why did they fail?" The advisor hesitated, as if choosing his words very carefully. "When they saw the Queen, they could not continue." Zane tilted his head. "Could not continue emotionally or physically?" The advisor blinked. "Emotionally? That sounds inconvenient for professional artists," Zane said. The advisor ignored the comment. "Queen Kyra's appearance is difficult for many of our people." Zane leaned slightly closer. "What does that mean?" The advisor spoke quietly. "She carries the ancient markings." Several of the other court members shifted uncomfortably. Zane noticed the tension immediately. "Ancient markings," he repeated. The advisor nodded. "A genetic trait connected to violent chapters in our history. Those who carry the markings were once feared as destroyers." Zane scratched his chin thoughtfully. "So people think the Queen looks dangerous?" "Yes." "And that makes them uncomfortable?" "Yes." Zane looked around the room. "Well," he said casually, "good thing I'm an artist." The advisor frowned. "You do not understand." "That's true," Zane admitted, "but misunderstanding has never stopped me before." Before the advisor could respond, the massive doors at the far end of the chamber slowly opened. The entire court immediately went silent. Zane turned toward the doorway. A tall figure stepped inside. Queen Kara moved with quiet confidence, her long ceremonial cloak flowing behind her like liquid silver. She looked very similar to a human woman, except for her long, elegant ears and the intricate dark markings that curved across her face. The patterns spread from her temples down across her cheekbones like natural ink drawn by invisible hands. Zane didn't react immediately. He simply watched. The court, however, was watching him, waiting. Queen Kyra stopped a few meters away from him. Her golden eyes studied him carefully, as if measuring how long it would take before he looked away. Several seconds passed. Zane stepped forward. He walked slowly around her once, examining her face from different angles. The entire room held its breath. Finally, Zane stopped in front of her again. He leaned slightly closer, squinting as if studying a complicated puzzle. Then he nodded thoughtfully. Queen Kyra raised one eyebrow. "Well," she said. Zane pointed gently toward the markings along her cheek. "May I ask something?" "You may." "Do those change depending on lighting conditions?" The queen looked genuinely surprised. "No." Zane leaned back, impressed. "That's incredible." The court members stared at him in disbelief. Queen Kyra crossed her arms slightly. "You are not afraid." Zane blinked. "Of what?" "My face." Zane looked confused for a moment. Then he smiled. "Your Majesty, I once painted a mining captain who insisted on smiling with his oxygen mask on. Trust me, that was much more terrifying." The silence that followed Zane's comment stretched across the chamber like a suspended moment in zero gravity. Several advisors looked as if their internal organs had briefly stopped working. One guard shifted his weight, clearly unsure whether laughing at a royal audience was considered treason. Queen Kyra studied the human in front of her. "You compare me to a miner wearing a breathing device," she said calmly. Zane raised a finger. "Correction, a miner smiling inside a breathing device. That detail makes the situation far more disturbing." A faint sound escaped one of the younger attendants. It took several seconds for everyone to realize that it was a suppressed laugh. The queen noticed. Her eyes shifted back to Zane. "You are unusual." "I hear that often," Zane replied. "You looked at my face and did not recoil." Zane tilted his head slightly. "Should I?" Kara's expression hardened just a little. "Most do." Zane leaned back, studying her face again with the patient curiosity of someone examining a rare artifact rather than a frightening one. His gaze moved slowly across the dark markings along her temples and cheekbones. "Those patterns," he said thoughtfully, "they're not random." The court stiffened. Kara narrowed her eyes. "Explain." Zane gestured gently toward her cheek. "They curve along natural bone structure. The lines follow the tension of your facial muscles. Whoever designed your species' genetics had excellent artistic instincts." The advisors exchanged confused looks. One whispered quietly to another, "Did he just compliment our evolutionary history?" Zane stepped slightly to the side, adjusting his view. "Actually," he continued, "from an artistic perspective, this is a gift." Kyra raised an eyebrow. "A gift?" "Yes." "You call the markings a gift?" Zane nodded. "Most portraits are boring." The room froze again. Zane sighed. "Not the people themselves, just the faces." He walked slowly toward the floating projection table in the center of the chamber and activated his portable drawing tablet. A soft blue screen appeared in the air. "I've painted hundreds of faces," he said, sketching quickly with a stylus. "Symmetry, smooth skin, predictable shadows. After a while, they start blending together." Lines appeared on the glowing screen. Kyra watched carefully. "So you prefer imperfections?" Zane shook his head. "No." He turned the screen toward her. "I prefer stories." The rough digital sketch already showed the outline of her face, the long ears, the confident posture, and the markings. But the markings were not hidden. They were emphasized. Their curves looked intentional, almost regal. Kyra stared at the image. "That is different." One of the advisors stepped forward immediately. "You cannot paint the queen that way." Zane looked over his shoulder. "That way? You highlight the markings." "Yes." "That is unacceptable." Zane blinked. "Why?" The advisor looked horrified. "Because those markings represent violence in our ancient history." Zane shrugged. "So do most human monuments." The advisor opened his mouth, then closed it again. Zane returned his attention to the sketch. History isn't something you erase, he said casually. It's something you understand. Kara's gaze remained fixed on the screen. You do not see them as ugly. Zane stopped drawing and looked up at her. No, you truly believe that? Yes. She crossed her arms slightly. Explain. Zane leaned against the table. Imagine two statues, he said. One is perfectly smooth. No cracks, no weathering, nothing interesting. Kyra waited. The other statue has chips, scars, pieces missing. You can see where time and storms tried to destroy it. He pointed gently toward the markings on her face. Which one tells the better story? The queen did not answer immediately. The room had grown completely silent again. Finally, she said quietly, the second. Zane smiled. Exactly. One of the advisors stepped forward again, clearly frustrated. This discussion is irrelevant. The portrait must represent the stability of the empire. Zane shrugged. Stability is boring. The advisor stared at him. Boring? Yes. He gestured toward Kyra. You want your queen to look perfect and distant. The advisor nodded. That is correct. Zane shook his head. That's not leadership. The advisor's expression darkened. And what would you call leadership, human? Zane glanced back at the queen. Surviving your own people's expectations. Kara's eyes narrowed slightly. Zane returned to his sketch, adding a few more lines. The portrait slowly became clearer. The queen's gaze looked strong, not frightening, not cursed. Strong. Kyra stepped closer to the projection. You work quickly. This is just a sketch. And you already decided how I will look. Zane shook his head. No. He pointed toward the screen. This is just the beginning. Kyra looked at him carefully. You are either very brave, she said slowly, or very foolish. Zane smiled. Most artists are both. For the first time since entering the chamber, something unusual happened. Queen Kyra laughed. It was quiet, but unmistakable. The laugh startled the entire court more than any dramatic declaration could have. Several advisors froze in place, as if the laws of physics had suddenly changed. One guard nearly dropped the ceremonial staff he had been holding with perfect discipline for the last 20 minutes. Zane blinked once. Well, he said thoughtfully, that's a good sign. Queen Kyra quickly composed herself again, though a faint trace of amusement still lingered in her expression. You believe that was a sign? Yes. Of what? That you are not secretly planning to throw me out an airlock. The younger attendants glanced nervously at one another. Kara tilted her head slightly. Why would I throw you out an airlock? Zane shrugged. Artists are fragile creatures. We worry about these things. A faint smile touched the corner of her mouth before she suppressed it again. You speak freely for someone inside a royal court. Zane looked around the enormous chamber. I noticed that. And it does not concern you? Your Majesty, he said calmly, if I were concerned about powerful people judging my work, I would have stopped painting a long time ago. Kara studied him again. There was something strange about this human. Not arrogance, not disrespect. Simply an absence of fear. She walked slowly toward the floating projection, where Zane's sketch still hovered in the air. The glowing lines reflected softly across the markings on her face. You truly intend to paint me like this? Yes. You will not soften the markings. No. You will not hide them. No. You will not adjust them to make the court more comfortable. Zane crossed his arms. Comfort is overrated. The advisors immediately erupted into quiet protest. Your Majesty, this is unacceptable. The people will misinterpret. Kara raised her hand. The room fell silent again. Her eyes remained on the floating portrait. You said these markings tell a story. They do. What story do you see? Zane stepped beside her. The story of someone who survived expectations. Kara's gaze shifted slightly. Explain. Zane pointed gently at the curve along her temple. Those lines aren't symmetrical like decorative markings would be. They follow stress patterns, muscle tension, emotional expression. One of the advisors muttered quietly, he is analyzing the queen's face like a scientist. Zane heard him. Artists are scientists, he said. The advisor frowned. Of what? People. Kara looked back at the sketch. You see strength. Yes. My people see danger. Your people are wrong. The advisors gasped again. Kara did not react immediately. Instead, she turned toward Zane. You are very confident for someone who has known me for less than an hour. Zane rubbed his chin. Technically, 47 minutes. That does not improve your argument. Maybe not, Zane admitted. He gestured toward the floating portrait. But faces are honest. Kara crossed her arms. Faces can lie. Expressions can lie, Zane corrected. Structure cannot. She narrowed her eyes slightly. You believe you understand me simply by looking. Zane smiled faintly. No. Then what do you believe? I believe you've spent most of your life being looked at the wrong way. For a moment, the Queen said nothing. That sentence landed harder than any argument. One of the advisors stepped forward again. Your Majesty, we should proceed with the formal portrait schedule. The court calendar. Zane suddenly clapped his hands once. Actually, I have a request. The advisor looked annoyed. You are not in a position to make requests. Zane ignored him and looked directly at Kara. Your Majesty, how many hours per day do you sit on that throne? Kara seemed slightly confused. Several. And how many hours do you spend walking around the palace like a normal person? I am not a normal person. That's not what I asked. The Queen hesitated. Very few. Zane nodded slowly. That explains it. Explains what? Why every artist before me failed. The advisor stiffened again. And you believe you know the reason? Yes. Zane picked up his equipment case. You cannot paint someone honestly while they sit on a throne pretending to be a statue. Kara's eyes narrowed slightly with curiosity. And what would you suggest instead? Zane slung the case over his shoulder. We walk. The advisors immediately protested again. That is not appropriate. The Queen cannot wander the palace for the sake of an artist? Zane pointed toward the floating sketch. You want a portrait of a ruler. He looked back at Kara. Then I need to see how you move. The Queen considered this for several seconds. Then, to the complete horror of the royal advisors, she turned toward the palace doors. Very well, she said calmly. Zane grinned. Great. One of the advisors whispered urgently, Your Majesty, this is highly irregular. Kara paused at the doorway and glanced back at him. So is he. Zane followed her toward the corridor. As the enormous doors slid open, he looked at the Queen beside him. You know, he said casually, most of my clients don't come with an empire. Kara glanced at him. And most of mine do not come with jokes. Zane shrugged. Give it time. The palace corridors stretched ahead of them, glowing softly with alien light as the Queen and the human artist disappeared into the endless halls. The palace corridors stretched endlessly ahead of them, glowing softly with shifting patterns of light that moved beneath the crystal floors like slow rivers of energy. Zane walked beside Queen Kara, while several guards followed at a careful distance, clearly uncertain whether this strange walking portrait session was brilliant or completely irresponsible. Zane glanced behind them. Are they here to protect you? He asked quietly. Or to make sure I don't escape? Kara didn't look at the guards. Both are possible. That's comforting, Zane said. They continued walking. Servants stepped aside as the Queen passed. Many lowered their heads respectfully, though some could not resist quick, curious glances toward the human walking casually beside their ruler. Zane noticed something interesting. The servants looked at Kara carefully, but their eyes rarely stayed on her face for long. He slowed his pace slightly. You see that, right? Kara did not ask what he meant. Yes. They look away. Yes. Zane folded his arms as they walked. That must get exhausting. It is normal. Normal does not mean pleasant. Kara gave a small breath that might have been a laugh. You assume many things about me. Zane shrugged. I paint people. That's basically professional assumption. They turned into a wide observation hall where enormous curved windows overlooked the planet below. The violet clouds moved slowly beneath the palace like massive oceans. Zane stopped walking. Okay, he said quietly. Kara stopped as well. What is it? Zane pointed toward the horizon. Your empire has excellent views. The Queen looked at the clouds. Yes. Did you design the palace? No. That's unfortunate. I was about to compliment your architectural taste. They stood there for a moment. Zane activated his tablet again, and the holographic sketch reappeared between them. The lines of her portrait floated softly in the air. Kyra studied it again. You adjust it while we walk. Of course. Why? Faces change when people move. She tilted her head. You mean expressions? No, Zane said. Posture. He made a small adjustment to the sketch. When you sit on the throne, your shoulders rise slightly. Kyra frowned. You notice that? Yes. Why? Zane shrugged. Because that's where your armor rests. She blinked once. You observe very small things. That's the job. He rotated the sketch slightly. But when you walk, he adjusted the shoulders in the portrait. You look lighter. Kyra watched the change. You are saying the throne makes me look heavier. Emotionally heavier. The queen stared at the image for a long moment. Perhaps it does. Zane looked around the observation hall. Tell me something. What? How many people here have told you that your markings are beautiful? Kara answered immediately. None. Zane nodded. That sounds about right. She looked at him carefully. And yet you insist they are. Yes. You are either honest or reckless. Those are not mutually exclusive. A small cleaning drone drifted across the room, quietly polishing the crystal floor before floating away again. Zane watched it for a moment. I like your robots. They are not robots. What are they? Autonomous maintenance constructs. Zane nodded slowly. Ah, fancy robots. Kara sighed softly. You simplify everything. Life is already complicated enough. He studied her face again. You know what's interesting? What? The markings don't make you look dangerous. The queen crossed her arms slightly. That is not what my people believe. Zane pointed toward the portrait. They make you look older. Kara's eyes narrowed. Older? Historically older. That explanation sounds suspicious. Zane laughed. I mean, they make you look like someone who carries history. She considered that. That is not how my advisors describe them. I've met your advisors. Kara raised an eyebrow. And? They look like people who iron their clothes before going to sleep. For the first time since leaving the throne room, Kara laughed again. It was louder this time. One of the guards looked extremely confused. Zane grinned. There it is again. What? That sound. My laugh. Yes. You seem very pleased with it. I am. Why? Zane saved the latest version of the sketch. Because people who laugh rarely look like monsters. The queen went quiet again. They stood side by side, looking out at the planet below. Finally, she said softly, My people have believed for centuries that these markings mean violence. Zane shook his head. No. No? They mean survival. She turned toward him slowly. You believe that very strongly. Yes. And if my people never accept that? Zane shrugged. Then your portrait will confuse them. A small smile appeared on her face. You enjoy causing confusion. I'm an artist, Zane said. It's practically a job requirement. The lights of the palace shifted gently as evening began to fall across the distant planet below. Zane studied her face again, quietly updating the portrait in the air. After a moment, Kara spoke again. You truly see something beautiful in these markings. Zane didn't hesitate. Yes. The queen looked at the floating image of herself. For the first time in her life, she did not immediately look away. The next morning, the palace woke slowly, but the royal advisors had clearly not slept much. Zane discovered this the moment he entered the grand studio chamber that had been prepared for the portrait. The room was enormous, filled with soft floating lights and projection grids that could display images at almost any scale. Several assistants were adjusting environmental controls while a group of advisors stood together, whispering in urgent voices. The moment Zane walked in, they stopped. He waved. Good morning, he said. No one waved back. Zane looked around the room. Wow, he muttered. You people really take portrait painting seriously. One advisor stepped forward. We take royal image very seriously. Zane nodded thoughtfully. That explains the tension. He placed his equipment case on a long floating table and activated several devices. Small drones emerged from the case, hovering quietly as they scanned the lighting of the chamber. One assistant stared at them. "What are those?" "My assistants. They are machines. So are half the artists I've met." The assistant frowned. Zane turned one of the drones slightly and adjusted the room lighting. "There," he said. The advisors watched him with visible suspicion. "You work in a strange way," one of them said. "Artists usually do." Before the advisor could respond, the chamber doors opened. Queen Kara entered. The room immediately straightened into perfect order. Guards aligned themselves along the walls. The assistants lowered their heads. Zane looked up from his equipment. "Morning," he said casually. Kara walked toward the center of the room. "You seem comfortable here." Zane gestured toward the enormous studio. "Your Majesty, you gave me a room bigger than my entire apartment." "That was not difficult," he smiled. "Fair." The Queen stepped onto the central platform prepared for the portrait. A soft field of light surrounded her position. Zane walked slowly around her, examining the angles of the lighting. "Turn slightly to your left." Kara did. "Good." He stepped back. "Now relax your shoulders." The Queen looked confused. "I am relaxed." "No, you're not." "I am the Queen." "Yes," Zane said. "And you are currently standing like someone expecting an assassination attempt." One of the guards stiffened slightly. Kara glanced at him. "That is a reasonable expectation." Zane sighed. "Okay. New plan." He walked over to the control panel and dimmed the lights slightly while adjusting several holographic projectors. The chamber filled with a warm, soft glow. The advisors looked concerned. "Why are you altering the lighting grid?" "Because your current lighting makes her look like she's being interrogated." The advisors exchanged uncomfortable looks. Zane returned to the platform. "All right," he said. "Let's try something simple." He activated the portrait projection again. The latest version of Kyra's image appeared beside her in the air. She studied it. "You continue refining it." "Yes. And it still emphasizes the markings." "Of course." One advisor stepped forward again. "Your Majesty, the Council strongly recommends—" Kara raised her hand. The advisor stopped immediately. Zane glanced at her. "Thank you. You speak too freely. I paint too honestly." Kyra looked back at the portrait. "Tell me something." "What?" "You truly believe my people will see this image differently?" Zane shrugged. "Maybe not immediately." "Then why do it?" He leaned against the edge of the platform. "Because someone has to start the argument." The Queen studied the image again. Zane adjusted a few more details with his stylus. "There," he said quietly. The portrait looked stronger now. The markings across her face curved naturally through the composition, not hidden, not exaggerated, simply present. Kyra stepped closer to the projection. "You are not painting a perfect queen." "No, you are painting something else." "Yes." "What?" Zane looked at her. "A real one." The room went silent again. Finally, one of the younger assistants whispered quietly to another. "It does look powerful." The advisor nearest them turned sharply. "Silence." But the assistant was still staring at the portrait. Zane noticed. He smiled slightly. "See?" Kara looked at the assistant. "What do you see?" The assistant hesitated, clearly terrified. "I see strength, Your Majesty." The Queen turned back toward the image. Zane watched her expression carefully. "You know what's funny?" he said. "What?" "When I first got the message about this job, I thought the dangerous part would be traveling across the galaxy." Kyra glanced at him. "And now?" He gestured toward the advisors. "Now I realize the dangerous part is convincing politicians that art exists." For the third time since meeting him, Queen Kyra laughed, and this time several people in the room smiled as well. The unveiling ceremony attracted more attention than Zane expected. Representatives from dozens of star systems filled the great ceremonial hall of the palace. Holographic transmitters floated quietly above the crowd, broadcasting the event across the Aurelian Empire. Advisors stood in careful formation near the platform, wearing expressions that suggested they had argued about this decision for several exhausting days. Zane stood near the edge of the hall with his arms folded. A young palace assistant approached him nervously. Are you not standing with the court artists? Zane looked around. I'm not a court artist. You painted the royal portrait. Yes. That makes you a court artist. Zane shrugged. I'm still deciding how I feel about that. The assistant glanced toward the enormous curtain hanging behind the central platform. The entire empire is watching. Zane nodded. That's slightly terrifying. You do not look terrified. That's because I'm pretending to be confident. The assistant seemed uncertain whether that was a joke. A sudden quiet spread across the hall. Queen Kyra had entered. She walked slowly toward the platform, wearing ceremonial armor that reflected the soft lights of the chamber. The familiar markings along her face were clearly visible beneath the glow of the projection lights. Some members of the audience looked away briefly out of old habit, but others watched her carefully, curiously. Zane noticed that. Kara reached the center of the platform. One of the senior advisors stepped forward. Today, he announced, the Empire witnesses the unveiling of the official portrait of Her Majesty Queen Kara. The enormous curtain behind the platform shimmered slightly as the projection systems activated. Zane rubbed the back of his neck. The assistant whispered beside him, You seem calm. I'm calculating how fast I can run if everyone hates it. That would be difficult. I noticed the guards. Kyra stood still as the advisor continued speaking. This portrait represents the strength and unity of the Aurelian Empire. Zane muttered quietly, No pressure. The advisor turned toward the curtain. With the Queen's permission, Kara nodded once. The curtain dissolved into light. The portrait appeared. It filled the enormous projection wall behind the platform, towering above the gathered crowd. For several seconds, no one spoke. The painting showed Kyra standing upright, her posture calm but powerful. The markings across her face curved naturally through the composition, highlighted by subtle lighting that made them look almost like natural constellations across her skin. They were not hidden. They were not softened. They were simply part of her. Zane watched the crowd carefully. The first reaction was silence. The second reaction was confusion. Then whispers began spreading through the audience. That is the Queen. They did not remove the markings? They look different. A diplomat from a distant system leaned closer to the projection. They look deliberate, another voice murmured. Strong. Zane exhaled slowly. Beside him, the assistant whispered, They are not afraid. Zane nodded. That's a good start. On the platform, Queen Kyra looked up at the portrait. For most of her life, she had avoided images of herself. The court painters always softened the markings or disguised them beneath ceremonial shadows. But this portrait did neither. This portrait looked directly at the truth. She stood quietly for a long moment. Then she turned to face the crowd. For generations, she said calmly, my people believed these markings were a curse. The hall remained silent. They believed they represented violence from our past. Her voice remained steady. But this portrait shows something else. She gestured toward the image behind her. It shows survival. Zane felt a small smile forming. Kyra continued. It shows history. The audience listened carefully. And it shows that strength is not something we hide. The whispers in the crowd shifted again. Now they sounded thoughtful, curious, not fearful. Kara stepped down from the platform and walked slowly through the crowd. No one stepped away from her. Some even held her gaze. Zane noticed that too. The assistant whispered beside him. They are looking at her differently. Zane nodded. That's what happens when someone tells a better story. Kara eventually reached him near the edge of the hall. You did not run. Zane shrugged. I considered it. She looked back at the portrait. My advisors predicted chaos. Politicians always predict chaos. And yet the empire remains calm. People usually are. She studied the painting again. For the first time, she said quietly, I do not feel the need to look away. Zane leaned against the wall. That means the portrait worked. Kara turned toward him. You did more than paint a portrait? Zane smiled. I just showed people what was already there. The Queen looked around the hall. Members of the court were now speaking calmly with visitors from other worlds. Some were even pointing at the portrait while discussing it with interest. The tension that had once surrounded her appearance was gone, replaced with something quieter. Acceptance. Kyra looked back at Zane. You changed how I see myself. Zane shrugged again. Artists do that sometimes. She tilted her head slightly. What will you do now, portrait artist? Zane thought about it. Well, he said, I hear there's a three-eyed diplomat on the outer colonies who wants a painting. Kara smiled. You travel the galaxy changing how people see themselves. Someone has to. She nodded slowly. Then she looked one more time at the portrait towering above the hall. For the first time in her life, Queen Kyra saw her own face not as a curse, but as a story worth telling.